So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Forest Stewardship Coast Redwoods webinar. We're happy to have you all here tonight. We've got several speakers lined up. Just before we dive right into the meat of it, just some technical things. If you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat box. And then at the end of each speaker's part, we'll go ahead and refer back to any of the questions that you might have. This session is being recorded and we will put it on our UC Forestry and Range YouTube channel. And we'll send you all a link as well as make it public when it is up and ready to run. Just real quick about Forest Stewardship. So my name is Kim Ingram. I'm the Forest Stewardship Coordinator for UC Cooperative Extension. The Forest Stewardship Program began in 2020 as an education and outreach program for forest landowners, those that work with forest landowners, those that just love forests and are looking at some workforce development or professional development in forestry. So really to help those groups of people learn more about their forests, how to be good and active stewards of their forest land. We'd have a workshop series that runs 9 weeks. We hold several of them across the state. But in addition to that, we host and co-host extra sessions, extra webinars and field days such as this one tonight, because there's a lot to know about forests in California, and we're just always learning and happy to have you all here with us. Katie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Katie Reedy. I'm the Post-Fire Resilience Education Coordinator. So it's also part of the stewardship program, but it is a post-fire, post-disturbance focus. So landowners and people who've been affected by wildfire across the state is our focus of our educational workshops. And our program began in 2022 and still going strong. We have our next workshop in El Dorado County this summer. And yeah, continuing the stewardship of green and black trees.
And then hopefully back to green once
again.
Yeah,
exactly, yeah.
All right. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and dive right in with our first speaker tonight, Kristen Shive, who's with UC Berkeley. She's a forestry specialist, and she's going to talk to us about coast redwood ecology and management pre-fire disturbance. And Kristen, we'll turn it over to you if you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and then dive right in. Happy to have you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Kim. I'm excited to be here. I don't know what else to add about myself, but I will say that I only recently joined UC about 1.5 years ago, and I spent a long time working in national parks as well as for Save the Redwoods League, which is where my sort of tie into the Redwoods has come from. And I will probably reference them a lot, actually, throughout my presentation, because I think they, along with many others, are doing a lot of really good work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hope that everyone can see it.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so we've sort of split this up where I'm going to talk about how we think about managing coast redwoods in forests that haven't burned in a really long time. And then we'll shift to Brian, who's going to talk about the post-fire landscape and what that looks like in terms of ecology and management. And then Cleo is going to kind of bring it home with a discussion about climate change and where these coast redwoods might go. And really, you're going to notice there's going to be a little bit of overlap between all three of ours because of course, all these things are very intertwined. So for my talk today, I want to start really big picture, and I get the fun job of just talking about some redwood basics. So probably things a lot of you know, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Talk a little bit about the fire history, and by this I mean, really sort of pre-European American settlement and what the adaptations to those fires means for forests today. Then this last century of change and how that sort of influences the status of our forests. And then moving forward, how do we think about managing our coast redwoods for resilience under a warming climate? So starting with redwood basics, prehistoric redwood distribution, they were global. And these are, related species that were around as long ago as the Triassic period. So think dinosaurs. So this is really a pretty ancient lineage of trees. Currently, we have 3 species in the subfamily that is redwoods that we think about. These, I think of them as 3 cousins. One is the dawn redwood, and this is a really cool conifer that is actually deciduous, which is pretty rare, meaning it'll lose its leaves with the seasons, the way that you might think of like broadleaf trees doing. These are located in China, and there's a few populations in a pretty limited area. But the other 2, we are lucky enough to have here in California. So of course there's the giant sequoia. Those exist in about 70 groves on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. And then what we're all here to talk about, these coast redwoods that we know and love, which are restricted, of course, to coastal zone, about 2.2 million acres, from just in the tip of Southern Oregon down to a bit south of Monterey. As you all probably know, they're the tallest tree on Earth. They have no end to their superlatives. I really like this schematic from the National Park Service, and it shows how these 3 redwood cousins fare. And you can see the coast redwood is sort of tall and skinny relative to the giant sequoia, which is a little bit shorter and stouter. I will note, though, that even the giant sequoia towers amongst its neighbors, the other conifers in the Sierra Nevada forest. So they're both quite tall. But the coast redwood, I believe the tallest one is around 380 feet. And they have a whole host of superlatives. So their bark is incredibly resistant to insects and pathogens. Their wood is really resistant to rot, which is one of the reasons it's such a valuable lumber species. And they're also highly fire adapted. And so, they have this very thick bark that helps insulate the inner living tissue called the cambium, so that as a fire comes through, the tree can survive. And so you can see, like, this is a prescribed burn photo, and as the fire is moving through the forest, like the heat of that fire is probably barely even registering to most of these trees. They have other really cool fire adaptations too. They can sprout from their base if their tops are totally killed, and that's all these green fuzzies that you see here in this photo. And most remarkable to me, as just someone who's been doing fire and forest ecology for a pretty long time now, is that they'll sprout along their trunks, even after losing all of their needles in a fire. And that is really unusual in the Western US. There's very few species that can do that. So it's a pretty remarkable trait. And all of these things, their resistance to insects, their fire adaptations, all of that helps contribute to their longevity, right? We know that some of the oldest trees are over 2,000 years old, which is really quite humbling when you go stand among them. Also, relatedly, that means that they end up storing more carbon per acre than any other forest type on the planet. So although they don't have a huge distribution, they still can play an important role in thinking about carbon storage in well-managed forests. And then another thing I just think is so cool is that they do host sort of entire mini ecosystems in their canopies, at least the old growth do. And like you can see in this picture, there are these fern mats that a lot of critters can call home. There's also, I've heard people talk about the branches get so big in the upper canopy that other trees have grown off the branches, and those trees themselves are quite large. So it's really it's a pretty impressive and complex ecosystem. And so I talked a little bit about some of the fire adaptations, and again, Brian's going to get way more into this, but I think it's important to understand sort of where those adaptations may have came from and what its fire history has been. And really, in sort of recent history, we think they had pretty frequent fire. We know they do. Since basically our oldest records go back to about the early 1700s. What I'm showing you here is a slice out of a tree. It's actually from a giant sequoia, because I could not find, and neither could Brian, a picture showing this, but I think it's kind of a neat way to understand how we interpret fire history. And what you see in that picture, and it's the same process that people use for a lot of the coast redwood work, is each of those lines represents a year, and then you can see those dark lines, which is where there was a fire. And people can cross-date them, and you can see how frequent fires were. And that's pretty wide-ranging how frequent they were, but they could be as frequent as every 8 years, up to about 50 years, during this period since the 1700s, where we have a really good record in our tree rings. Coast redwoods are tricky. they had skip ring years sometimes. You can't really see them, so we can't go back quite as far as we can in giant sequoia. But we know in many areas it was very frequent. And we think that was mostly the result, or we know that was mostly the result of indigenous burning, because as you all know, on the coast, we don't get a ton of lightning. And overall, it's not super conducive to regular burning because you need an ignition and then you need the climate to be conducive. And so really the indigenous burning brought in the ignition source. And that probably went on for quite a bit before even our records start in the 1700s. Having said that, so that means, you know, when fires are frequent, you probably have all heard this many times in California, and it's usually the story coming out of sort of the Sierra Nevada. When fires are coming through on a regular interval, say every 10 years, there isn't as much time for fuel to build up. And so they're generally of low to moderate severity. But remember I said that this is a species with an incredibly long lineage. And so we think on really long timescales, you know, and away from indigenous settlements, that there were probably longer fire-free periods. So, you know, a time when there wasn't an ignition source because we didn't really have the lightning, and it wasn't even necessarily hot and dry enough for things to burn regularly. And so in those areas, we probably got what we think of as infrequent high severity fire. So basically enough time goes by, there's fuel buildup, and then you get a storm accompanied by really hot, dry weather, and then you will get this stand replacing fire, is what we often refer to it as, where the entire crown is consumed. And that is probably where their ability to robustly sprout along the bowl comes from, potentially. You know, other conifers can do this a little bit, but none in the Western U.S., I should say, or well, a couple. Let me back up. Not many in the Western U.S. can do this after a high severity fire and survive. So it's a pretty remarkable species. Okay, so now we know kind of where we've been or where we were long ago. And now I just want to talk a little bit about that century of change. You know, when European Americans showed up in, like, I guess it's more than a century now, but the late 1800s, and things started to get really different. So one thing that happened was we started to exclude fire from the system, and that was by putting out the few lightning strikes, but also, of course, by you know, forcibly removing indigenous people from their land and outlawing their burning practices. I will say that there has, you know, been, without that fire, there has been an accumulation of fuels and trees that have infilled. But I will say that, like the Sierra Nevada, for folks more familiar with that story, we didn't, in the old growth, we haven't quite got that crazy density of infilled trees. But there still has been an accumulation of fuel for sure without that fire. But I think what is honestly, to my mind, more important in the coast redwood range was the history of logging. So, you know, it started, as you can see here, with this like individual with the crosscut saw kind of way back in the day. And people really, the lumber was so good and so valuable that widespread logging starting to occur. And it really continued into late the last century in terms of what you might call like whole-scale logging without as much, in some areas, without as much consideration for the ecology of the system. Over time, that changed in a lot of places in the last century, but there were some areas, probably many of you heard of the Redwood Wars and the Timber Wars, where things were still very aggressive. And so what I think is really important, we think about how to manage our forests in the coast redwood range, is that, you know, 90% of the old growth is gone, 95%, excuse me. And so what you see here on this map from Save the Redwoods League website is in green, there again is that coast redwood distribution. And the orange is the existing old growth. So there are just a few islands really out there, mostly concentrated in the north. And so that means that the vast majority of these forests are what we would call second growth forests. And so you can see here, this is actually a stump just that was cut pretty high, the blackened large tree in the middle. And then you see all these small living trees around it, which many of you have probably seen as fairy rings. And that's because they have that remarkable sprouting ability. Once the tree is cut, it sends up a bunch of basal sprouts, and those become the trees of the future. But you can see that that means that one tree just got replaced by 7, 8, 10 trees. And so it really increases the density or the number of trees in the forest. In addition, many of the logged sites, particularly far on the North Coast, were then seeded with Douglas fir at times, like I think from the 50s to 70s, when it, the way the market was working, it was a more desirable species. So that added additional trees in the forest, so increased that density further. And so when we think about this change, here this picture shows, it's an old growth condition, and there are some estimates that say about 50 trees per acre is how many you probably should have had. And now we're getting places where we have over 2,000 trees per acre. So it's really a very dramatic change in the state of our forests and the condition of our forests. And one of the biggest problems with this, of course, is the fire hazard. I said that we have to have kind of these extreme conditions sometimes to get really hot fire in the coast redwood range. It needs to be that hot and dry like it was in 2020. But the amount of trees out there and the amount of fuel to burn still really does matter. There's some work that's going to be coming out soon from Humboldt State University, Jeff Kane's lab, that looked at the drivers of fire severity in the CZU complex, and they found indeed that the higher density stands really did burn a lot hotter. So it really matters from a fire hazard standpoint. You also lose a lot of habitat features. There are a lot of critters that are just more dependent on old growth characteristics versus these really small kind of spindly trees. And it takes a very long time for them to for these stands to develop and get the complexity that can offer those types of features. I mean, for example, I think one of the most famous ones in the coast redwood range is the marbled murrelet, which is a seabird that nests directly on the branches of old growth trees. So they have to be very large, and that's not going to happen in forests like this for a really long time. And then in some areas, there's also lots of logging roads. And then again, these are much older logging roads. When people put in logging roads today, there's a lot more care and regulation, frankly, to make sure that they are not having a negative impact on hydrology. But if you go, throughout the many years, a lot of our forests had these put in ways that were not necessarily up to the standards that we hold now. So we've got this history of logging, and then we also have climate change. And we think about, this, I'm sure you all have seen so many graphs like this, but it's showing the degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's been rising for a while since the Industrial Revolution, but that it's really spiked, and then in the past 15 years, that rate has gone, as this New York Times schematic shows, is 40% higher than it was even in the 70s. So those red dots versus the orange dots with, time on the x-axis there. And climate change has the potential to impact redwoods in two key ways. The first is just tree stress. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that can seem really complicated at first, but they're actually not too bad, so bear with me. So this is some work from Steve Sillett and others trying to understand tree growth and the tree growth response to basically to environmental conditions. And so it's very busy, but bear with me. So if you look on the x-axis, what that is just, think of it just as tree growth, and it's tree growth relative to what you would expect for the size of the tree. And that is shown, that's on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis there, we have years. So these are shown in annual increments. The numbers on the side are the two panels. Basically, the one that's starting way up north, and you go all the way down through 22. And then that is sort of mid and sort of the middle of the coast redwood range. And then the second panel on the right starts kind of in that middle latitude and goes all the way down to the southern end of the range. And when you look at this, the two important things are, if it shows red, that's basically showing less growth than expected for the tree of that size. And if it's showing blue, you're getting more growth than expected for a tree of that size. And when you just kind of glance at this quickly, one thing that stands out to me is that since the 1970s, there's actually a lot of these, this is in primary forests or old growth forests. In a lot of these areas, you're actually getting more growth in recent decades than you did prior to that. We kind of would expect the opposite, especially with that 2014 to 2016 drought. There's some hypotheses that this might be due to the increase in carbon availability because of all the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere, and the trees can take that up and grow faster. There might have also been a decrease in fog. But I think one of the keys is you're not seeing a big dip during the drought. So basically, most of these sites weren't very phased in during the drought, except for, if you look at the lower right corner, those are the southern sites. And you can see in that between 2010, 2020, that's where we are getting some dips in growth. So although it was a very minor impact on the old growth in Coast Redwood, I think it's important to know we have more of this to come. And I think these are some early warning signs for tree stress. And the thing is, if you look at what is called secondary forest here, or that second growth, all those skinny little trees, you think about it, there's a lot of trees in one place competing for the same resources. They're really competing, say, during the drought for that limited water. And what you can see here, this graph is similar. They have fewer locations, but up at the top is the north, all the way down to the bottom is the southern end of the range. And you can see they have a lot more red near the end of the measurement period, that 2010 to 2020, which means there are a lot of these sites where trees were growing slower than expected for their size, meaning they were feeling the impacts of this drought. So those are these are kind of like the more, you might think, like direct effects of climate change, of hotter temperatures and more drought. But then the other thing is that climate change is going to influence more wildfire. And so this is another somewhat complicated graph. I keep bugging the authors to make a clearer one. But, in a nutshell, on the y-axis, that kilometers by 1,000, basically that's area burned. And then on the x-axis, it's March to October. So that's basically fire season VPD, which is vapor pressure deficit. What's really important here is it's fire season dryness, basically. And we all know that when it's drier and hotter, you're going to get more fires. And what you can see is that as that dryness increases, goes from, their values of 10 to 14, an increase in area burned. And the difference in the orange and the teal dots are, the teal ones are before 2000. And you can see things were already kind of going up. But from 2000 to 2018, those are all the orange dots. We're getting major increases in aridity or in dryness, and we're also getting big increases in area burned. So the point is that these threats are, they're real. So what we have is a double, or maybe you could even call it a triple whammy, because climate change has the potential to exacerbate tree stress. Although Coast Redwoods have done far better than other forests in the state, they still have shown some signal of tree stress during the drought in some areas. And you have poor forest health because of the history of logging in many areas. And I'm talking more, and I want to be clear here that not all logging is bad. Of course, I'm going to talk more about that, but these aren't areas that were logged and sort of walked away from. And I think that characterizes a lot of, especially small private landowners have inherited properties like this throughout the Coast Redwood Range. So then the question is, how can we prepare our redwood forest for an uncertain future? And there's a few things we can do. I have to say, in the old growth, there's not as much to do. Restoring fire would help, though. And I think we know there's also some forthcoming work from folks at San Jose State that found in the CZU fire in Big Basin, areas that had prescribed burn before the fire retained more canopy than areas that had not. So it is helpful to keep putting fire through prescribed burning on the ground, as Indigenous people did for a very long time. In the second growth, it's a little bit more complicated. I think it's going to take more work. Eventually, sure, these trees could sort of do some self-thinning and maybe start getting on that trajectory to old growth, but we have fire risk in the meantime, and it's just going to take a very long time to get there. And so we can use tools like mechanical thinning to sort of just help start putting them on that trajectory to more sort of old growth characteristics, if that's what's desired on your property. And so the reason for this is that you would cut trees even if timber wasn't your goal, is that, again, if you go back to this picture, all of these trees are little straws sucking water out of the forest floor and using resources and competing for light. And when you remove a bunch of them and when you open that up, you now are giving more resources to the trees that are left behind so that they can get bigger faster. And so as an example, and I'm going to reference this project quite a bit because I think it's done some really cool things, is from what's called Redwoods Rising up in Redwood State National Parks, which is in partnership with Save the Redwoods League. And you can see this is a plot before it was thinned, and this is that same plot after. And it's wildly different. And one of the things that strikes me is not just that there are fewer trees, and they do look like they're getting a little bit bigger, but there's also a lot more light hitting the forest floor. similar to the canopy, particularly when in areas where there was a heavy Doug fir seeding, they will really compete in the crowns. And so you can see this is a picture looking up at the canopy before the thinning and after thinning. And so these are really going to create very different environments for the coast redwoods that are growing there and potentially help them to sort of get back to being the dominant species in the stand where that is appropriate in your goal. But there are some challenges. So there have been several scientific studies that have supported what I just said. There's they took a couple of different approaches to thinning, like, only thinning the very small trees, we call it low thin, to taking a little bit more out of the canopy and variable density thinning. And they showed that there was a really good growth response as intended, but there were some other challenges. So first, here's a cut stump. And because they're such good sprouters, there are going to be sprouts that come up after you do the thinning. And that actually, remember, you're trying to remove the number of trees in the forest. And this sort of is going to, eventually, these are going to get bigger and can add to the number of trees. The other one is actually bear damage. This one, I remember, surprised me a lot when I learned about it, but it makes a lot of sense. So the bears really will like to eat the cambium, which is that living tissue under the bark. And I guess when when you do thinning and you sort of, we call it give a growth release to these trees, they can grow really vigorously for a while and they get really sweet. That cambium has a lot of sugars and the bears seek it out. And so they will tear the bark from these trees and they will go to town and have great snacks. And that's problematic for two reasons. One, sometimes it does girdle and kill the tree, and these are the target trees that you left behind. And two, they also, can also stimulate more sprouting and more of that ingrowth that you're not necessarily looking for. And so to me, this isn't say that we don't do it or that thinning is not the right approach. It's simply that it's going to take more ongoing management to sort of get on that trajectory towards a healthier, more open forest dominated by larger trees. So as I already mentioned, I wanted to highlight this Redwoods Rising partnership because I think it's just doing so much cool work up there. And this is in Redwood State National Park. You can see that outline in the map, and the dark orangish red areas are the planned restoration areas outside of old growth. And, here are just a bunch of bullets of everything they've accomplished in the last 5 years. I think, forestry thinning on over 3,000 acres is a lot, taking out a lot of poorly designed logging roads. And basically then they, doing a ton of this work, and they have ambitions to do thousands and thousands of more acres. And what I think is really cool is they've done it, being that they're a very much beloved state national park, they've been able to get a lot of funding from the government to do some of this work. But they've also been able to rely on the biomass return or, the sale of those logs to help pay for the restoration. So this is a huge benefit from, with prescribed fire, there's not really a lot of return. You're just making something safer. But here you can actually take those wood products and have it help pay for making your forest healthier. And then you can even really get into the weeds. You can manage even more so for habitat. So there's something called trunk reiterations, or just like all these kind of crazy bends you see. This is from these candelabra trees up on the Lost Coast. And these are very extreme, and most of the trees don't look like this. But what does happen in a lot of old growth conditions is that when trees have been around for thousands of years, they'll have tops break, and then they have to sort of shoot up. One of their side branches becomes the new, what we call leader, or the new sort of main stem. And that makes for, again, really complex habitat. And people have experimented even then with trying to sort of basically top or knock off pieces of the top of the tree to start, pushing for these habitat features. Again, it depends what you're managing for. And if you are managing for timber, then you're not going to want to mess with the pristine form of your tree. But if you're managing for, say, for either more for restoration or for a mix of things, you might do something like this on some of those trees. And I just want to note, like, a lot of what I have talked about really applies to managing for timber as well, because again, when you thin out the small trees, you can increase the growth and yield from the trees that are left behind. And I think ultimately what your, what your approach is going to be is going to be somewhere on the spectrum of, are your objectives to purely manage for timber or to purely manage for, habitat and conservation? And probably for most landowners in the region, it's probably somewhere in between, and you have to figure out where that on that sort of slider bar it fits, and that's going to really impact exactly what prescription you use. But I would say in most of the second growth forests, some active management is really probably going to be necessary to meet whatever those goals are. So the take home to me is that redwood forests do need active stewardship to enhance resilience in the 21st century. That I feel like is, I hope, the take home. It's even when you are seeking more restoration or conservation goals. And I think that's really important because for a long time, I think many of us thought of that as like, it meant we had to be hands off. But I think what we're learning, especially with recent fires, is that we need to be a bit more hands on, particularly in areas that have a history of past management that have not done it any favors. So with that, I will close and we can move to questions.
Thank you, Kristen. That was amazing. Very thorough. We do have a few questions here in the chat. This one's a two-part question. So when more light hits the floor, redwoods brush out at the base. Is that desirable?
Well, I think they'll brush out at the base with and without that light. Like I've seen very closed forests do that. It's more about their stress response to disturbance. If they get light, those sprouts that brush can be more vigorous for sure if it has more light. But I think to me, it's about that end goal. And when you think, I did pick the picture of like the smallest second growth and most crowded possible to kind of make the point. Of course, there's a lot of variation out there. But I think if your end goal is to get larger trees, then you're going to want to take thin and sort of deal with the fact that, and even though with some light, you might get some additional sprouting. You're going to want to manage that sprouting rather than not taking things out. I think if you want to accelerate that trajectory, I think you're still better off, risking some additional ingrowth.
Yeah, and so then if you remove some of it, high winds can sometimes cause the remaining trees to twist or split vertically. Is this a problem or concern, or how do you manage wind when you remove some of the other trees?
I think that can be a concern, and I think you just really need to work with your forester to make sure that you aren't sort of removing too much, and it also has to do with the terrain. But in general, I think we've been thinning in many forests for a very long time. Whatever your objectives are, and I do not think that wind throw is such a concern that I wouldn't let it stop me. But that's why you work with a registered professional forester who can really help you think through like the stature of your stand and how thinning may or may not impact some of those other dynamics.
Nice. Yeah, it's good to think about. Okay, we've got another question here. With some of the redwoods in California state parks, are all parks open to prescribed fire or prefer thinning, especially when they are close proximity to towns?
Sorry, so the question is, are they all open to prescribed fire?
Are parks open to prescribed fire, or do they prefer thinning?
My understanding is that state parks has really embraced prescribed fire, and they've done quite a bit of it. And probably until the work up in Redwoods Rising, I think that was more heavily their tool in the Redwood range. But that is shifting. And so and your point about communities is a good one. I'm sure basically all the burn bosses at the individual units they're gonna have to think for themselves if it's safe to conduct a burn, given their proximity to town and what the terrain is like and all of that. But I know there is a dedication to using fire because it's an ecological process where they can. But again, that's a really appropriate tool in old growth. It can be harder in second growth because the trees are so dense, and sometimes thinning first can help reduce the complexity of implementing burns into the future. So I think what I'm trying to say is that my understanding is that they were a little bit more reliant on prescribed fire as the primary tool before, and that's changing in a way that I think is positive because I think we need to embrace all the tools in the toolbox and use the right one in the right place.
Yeah, I would echo that. I agree. Another question. So in management, what are the best ways to manage the sprouting? And does that always mean pesticides or herbicide?
It doesn't, but it is true that if you thin your sprouts it can just stimulate more sprouting. But I believe, and I'd love, like, Brian should weigh in on this too, because we've been having conversations about this, which is, if you actually want to wait and let them get a little bit more established. And I think some of the literature has said like 5 to 10 years. So you're getting, they're getting sizable, and then taking them out. And it's less likely to cause the cycle of sprouting, like stimulating sprouting of like extreme, like, I think it's less likely to make the tree panic and to shoot up a million.
I like that. Yeah. Yeah. I get that question a lot in our post-fire landscape, is then how do we manage those sprouts? So I have a feeling Brian might talk about that next. So with that, are there any other questions for Kristin this evening? If you have any more, feel free to put them in the chat. But I'm not seeing any actively coming in. So thanks so much, Kristin. Really appreciate your expertise and knowledge. It's always great to hear what you're up to. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Kristen. All right, we're going to turn it over to Brain Woodward now. He is a forestry advisor with Cooperative Extension. And Brian, feel free to add more to your intro, and off you go.
Thanks a bunch. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first, thanks to Kristin. Fantastic kind of overview that leads right into my presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about post-fire ecology of coast redwood forests. I'm the forest advisor for Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties. So post-fire ecology and management is on the top of my mind in these systems. So I first started thinking about post-fire in redwood forests actually following the 2017 Chetco Bar fire. That's a fire that burned the northernmost stand of coast redwood forest just over the border into Oregon. And that was just 6 or 7 years ago. But at that time, there were really only a select few fires of any size that had occurred in the coast redwood forest in the past few decades. So this seemed like a really unique opportunity. Since then, a lot's changed. The 2020 lightning fires occurred. Those fires burned forests from Sonoma to Santa Cruz, but particularly in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And I think those fires really kind of, for one, gave us an opportunity to look at how fire affects forests in these systems a lot more closely. But it kind of altered a lot of folks' perceptions as to the size, scale, and effects that fire can have in these systems. So today I'm going to be talking primarily about the ecological response of coast redwood forests to fire. I am confident that coast redwood forests are some of the coolest post-fire environments that exist in any forest type across the world. So I want to share with you all those traits and cool things about those. And then I want to talk about some recent fires in the coast redwood range, some burn severity trends, as well as some of the unknowns for the future as conditions change, as Kristin discussed. And then I'll touch on post-fire management considerations in these forests, particularly under these changing conditions. So Kristin gave us a fantastic overview of the historical fire regime in coast redwood forests. So I'm going to jump right into the modern forest condition. Over the past century, fire has been really infrequent in these forests. So less than 10% of all coast redwood forests have burned in the last 40 years. And actually, of that less than 10%, half of that burned in 2020 alone. So the vast majority of the coast redwood range has not seen fire in at least 40 years, but the vast majority a lot longer than that. And that's a concern because in a lack of fire over time, you accumulate more fuel. And with more fuel can, in some cases, result in higher severity fire that can have ecological consequences, economic consequences, but also consequences for our communities. So what makes coast redwood forests pretty cool, and Kristin covered this a little bit, it's that they have a different post-fire recovery trajectory really than almost any other conifer forest in the world. Not any other conifer forest, but almost any other conifer forest in the world. So When I first started working in fire ecology in forests, I worked in forests like that on the left. And this is a subalpine conifer forest that's been affected by high severity fire. This system, it was a stand replacing fire, so the canopy is lost. The vast majority of the trees are on the landscape, but those few trees that are remaining are so important because they're the trees that are going to produce cones, that are going to produce seeds, that are going to be dispersed across this landscape. And over time, in a best case scenario, you see these systems recover through seedling regeneration. But those trees in the foreground, there's no opportunity for those trees to live. What separates redwood forests really is their ability to sprout epicormically. So you really don't see true stand replacing fire in these systems, or we haven't yet. And that's attributable both the ability to sprout from the base, but primarily this ability to sprout from the trunk. So the same tree that's present in pre-fire conditions sprouts from its parent stem or its bole and regrows canopy on that same tree that was present in pre-fire conditions. So coast redwood forests are structurally diverse across the range, as Kristen mentioned. So when we think about how coast redwood forests respond to fire, we also have to think about the pre-fire condition of the forest. So the vast majority of forests in the coast redwood region look much more like that on the left or in the middle throughout the coast redwood range than that on the right, which is an old growth forest from up north. So based upon the density, based upon the tree size, you're going to see a very different response of these forest systems to fire. So something you have to think about when we think about response and recovery of these systems over time. The next thing that I think is really important when we think about the way that coast redwood forests respond to fire is that coast redwood isn't the only tree in this forest system. They're forest communities, and each species within this community has a differential response and resistance to fire. And that's really driven by species-specific adaptation and biological characteristics that have developed through evolutionary time. So a typical coast redwood forest community, often you have coast redwood and Douglas fir. There are other conifer species present throughout the range. But within that forest system, you also have multiple size classes of those trees. You have old growth, you have young redwood and Douglas fir, as well as a diverse community of hardwoods, tan oak, Pacific madrone, other species, depending upon where you are in the range, as well as an understory shrub community. So down here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, currently we've got ceanothus. Up north, you might see rhododendron. So each one of those species responds to fire a little bit differently, has different adaptations, and I'm going to go over some of those adaptations now. The first, which we've already discussed, is this epicormic sprouting. And coast redwoods have the ability to resprout not just from their parent stem, but also their branches. And if we look at this image on the right, and you see coast redwood, both these individuals in the middle, and you compare it to the way that Douglas fir, its community associate, responds to fire, the ability to sprout epicormically is a fantastic trait in forest systems. This Douglas fir has no ability to resprout that canopy. Douglas fir as a species in this particular stand is going to be completely reliant upon seed to regain its status in this community. Coast redwood, in contrast, loses that canopy and regenerates rapidly following fire. This allows individuals to maintain canopy space, and it provides that significant competitive advantage when you compare it to species like Douglas fir. Now, I said that this trait was unique, mostly unique to coast redwood forests, but this is present in systems across the world, and it's present in systems that have vastly different fire regimes than coast redwood forests. Regardless, it's really an advantageous trait. So if we look at this Twitter post from the right, which I just saw a couple of weeks ago, this is a system in Spain with a pine species that's actually able to resprout epicormically. Very different environment than coast redwood forest systems, but as you can see, it's very advantageous in that system as well. This is a topic that I could give a whole hour-long presentation on, epicormic sprouting, but I encourage you to dive into this paper, epicormic sprouting in fire-prone systems. I find it really fascinating. Another trait that's kind of variable across species within the coast redwood community is bark structure and thickness. And, you know, bark is kind of the first line of defense for a tree when it comes to fire. And in Coast Redwood's case, you've got this bark that's soft and stringy. In a way, it's kind of wick-like, but it's very thick and it can protect the tissue from fire. But it also has this interesting characteristic where it can kind of attract fire up a tree. And I'll discuss that a little bit more later. And then there's Douglas fir. This is a tree that has hard, textured, thick bark that at one point in time we thought largely protected it from even the highest severity fire. And that's really just a way for that tree to resist fire. Once again, this species has no ability to sprout. Then we look at a species like Pacific madrone, which is a hardwood, and they have literally very, very thin bark. Small individuals, almost no bark at all. Larger individuals, less than half an inch. So their bark provides little to no resistance to fire. Instead, the species is able to resprout rapidly from its base, much like Coast Redwood. So when we look at that trait, basal sprouting, this is another trait that's pretty unique to Coast Redwood. So we can attribute Coast Redwood's ability to still make up the vast majority of its range to this particular trait. We chopped down the vast majority of redwoods throughout the range and it resprouted from its base. That's a really amazing characteristic to have, both in response to fire and both in response to other disturbances, like logging, for example. This is something that's quite unique to a conifer, but isn't particularly unique to hardwoods. So Pacific madrone can resprout from its base, so can tan oak. So voracious resprouting in response to fire is not unique overall. You don't have to have the parent tree die for a tree to resprout from its base. It can resprout, particularly in the case of redwood, it can sprout a lot in response to fire, even if the parent tree lives. And obviously, this helps a tree rapidly regenerate and compete for space following a fire. And these trees, both of these species, have the ability to produce seedlings, but you know, the sprouting ability allows them to rapidly regenerate in comparison. A characteristic of redwood that I mentioned, its bark. A lot of folks talk about how redwood has bark that's not very flammable. And in reality, redwood bark is actually quite flammable. It can wick fire up the bark of tree, but it's very resistant to fire because it's really very thick, and then it has the ability to epicormically resprout. But this is a really interesting adaptation as well, because when it carries fire up into its canopy, even in low severity fire, you've got other less fire resistant species like Douglas fir, for example. When fire reaches the canopy of Coast Redwood and spreads out to Douglas fir, in this case, Coast Redwood has kind of won. Its neighbor has died, and it's going to rapidly resprout from its base and might take over that canopy space. So a really interesting characteristic. It also has really flammable needles. So Coast Redwood needles carry fire really readily. And I just wanted to show a quick video, if it comes through, of a fire just from last week that I was working on, and a prescribed fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains. You can see those trees in the background are all Coast Redwood. And this is a relatively low severity fire, but fire has been drawn up into those Coast Redwoods and is burning quite readily. And this is a flame length of like 6 to 12 inches, so a relatively low severity fire that's occurring here. But as you can see, the fire behavior has resulted in those redwoods burning, bark burning, but those trees will live once again. So how do Coast Redwood forest communities respond to wildfire across burn severities? Let's just go ahead and dive into that. Burn severity is basically just the magnitude of ecological change caused by a fire. And in the Coast Redwood system, we typically think that there's been a mosaic of burn severity. So if you look at all of the fire footprints across the Coast Redwood region in recent time, what we've seen is a mix of low and moderate and high severity fire. Most recently, fires have been dominated by low and moderate severity fire, with kind of a smattering of high severity patches throughout a system. In 2020, that changed quite a bit. So this graph looks kind of complicated, but it's really just the response of 4 different redwood community species to fire across sizes and burn severities. So all I'm trying to display here really is that because of those different adaptations that these species have and different responses to fire and different sizes and structures, these species are all going to respond quite a little bit differently based upon those characteristics. So for example, coast redwood, if we look down here at the post-fire responses, has the ability to die. The top can die and it can regenerate basally. It can just die. The parent stem can survive and it can resprout its canopy, or it can just live. But in the case of Douglas fir, for example, that tree can just live or it can die. Only two different post-fire outcomes. And if we look at these graphs, you can just start tracing the y-axis and seeing that based upon the size of the tree, these species respond quite differently to the severity of fire from low to high. So let's look at low severity fire. Low severity fire, you still see relatively commonly small tree mortality of both coast redwood and Douglas fir, as well as hardwoods. But redwood and hardwoods sprout back from the base, and Douglas fir does not. And we're talking about pole-sized trees, so trees that are 10 to 12 inches or less. Low severity fire kind of begins the reduction of understory fuels. You start to see a lot of sticks and twigs burned up, but many large down trees, they're not going to be significantly affected by low severity fire necessarily. You start to see the understory shrub layer be consumed or die. In this case, the shrub layer may rapidly regenerate either by seed or sprout, depending upon where you are in the range. In the case of low severity fire, large redwood and Douglas fir, they're largely unaffected. So in this two images here, you see coast redwood, low severity fire. The fire has just kind of crept up its bark, but a year after the fire, it hasn't even resprouted basally. The primary effect in low severity fire is to the understory fuels and smaller trees. Now in moderate severity fire, you start to see a little bit more change. So for coast redwoods, moderate severity starts to result in pretty voracious epicormic sprouting. So in the image in the background, you can see that both the branches and the bole of these trees, or the stem of the trees, is sprouting in response to moderate severity fire. In most cases, large redwoods can still survive. This is how they respond. And you have all of the effects, of course, of lower severity fire as well. One difference kind of between moderate severity and high severity fire in coast redwood forest systems is that the upper branches of coast redwood can survive in moderate severity fire. So you see resprouting. So the canopy is able to regenerate not just from the parent stem, but also from the branches that were present in pre-fire conditions. Most hardwoods like Pacific madrone and tan oak die in this case and are resprouting really voraciously about a year following fire. And this is where you start to see some pretty significant understory fuels reduction as well. Now, high severity fire, if we look at this graphic on the right, this is the case of high severity fire in a coast redwood Douglas fir forest system up in Oregon. Here you can see that there's been considerable compositional change in this forest community for the foreseeable future. So all of those skulls and crossbones are Douglas fir. All of those canopy spaces have opened up. And then in this case, all of the coast redwood have lived and are resprouting from their branches and their bole. High severity fire has the ability to kill Douglas fir of all sizes, including old growth. Bole sprouting and basal resprouting responsive redwood, it can intensify. These trees start to look kind of like pipe cleaners. But as you can see in the upper canopy here, these branches, the fire was too intense. Those branches have died and have no ability to resprout. So that's going to result in much slower recovery of these forest systems over time, particularly when it comes to canopy cover. High severity fire also has significant effects on the structure of individual trees. So you start to see older trees kind of, in some cases, structurally collapse. It's still quite rare, but it can occur. And you start to see the most intense modifications across forest strata. So from forest floor to canopy and a longer recovery time overall. But once again, stand replacing fires largely absent on coast redwood sites. Really interesting characteristic of coast redwood as well is that as fire severity increases, coast redwood sprouting increases. So you see more sprouts and sprouts grow taller. And this is just another indicator that coast redwood has evolved alongside high severity fire. High severity environments provide a lot of open canopy space and a lot of opportunity for these young trees to colonize new space. So you can see this is just 2 years following fire, and this basal sprout is already over 2 meters tall. It's just really incredible growth in post-fire environments. In the CZU complex, 1 month after fire, I was out in the burn footprint, and I already saw basal sprouting. I just couldn't believe it, honestly. I mean, these sprouts are probably 6-8 inches tall. There's just absolutely no ability for any seedlings to establish in this system. So this ability to basal sprout is a really important characteristic for coast redwood to dominate these post-fire systems. Post-fire environments are also really conducive to seedling development and seedling establishment. And seedlings are important because they promote the resilience of a forest community over time. So on sites where maybe all the Douglas fir died, it provides seedlings provide new opportunities to colonize these sites. On the right, you can see coast redwood seedlings. On the left, Douglas fir. Much slower growth than sprouts, but very important in the post-fire recovery of these systems. So here's an example, once again, just more seedlings, but on the right, you can see Douglas fir seedlings and coast redwood seedlings establishing in one patch. And you see this a lot in post-fire systems. It's a patch on the forest floor that either got a lot of light or the bare mineral soil was just perfect. And you saw a seedling establishment of both species in one site. And I always like these because it kind of makes you think about the kind of slow term competition that's happening between these little small trees. And it kind of looks like a small forest, which I think is really fun to think about. Coast redwood systems also have a really crazy understory response to fire, depending upon where you are in the range. Up north in Oregon, I saw this really intense resprouting of coast rhododendron, and within a few years, you had coast rhododendron blooming again. In the CZU complex down in Santa Cruz, you saw intense development of ceanothus, like you see on the left. So in this case, fire initiated a seed bank. You know, there wasn't a lot of ceanothus present in like Big Basin or lots of areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains in pre-fire conditions. Instead, those seeds were waiting following the last fire, and the shrub layer initiated and grew up quite rapidly. It's over my head in many cases. This is a fairly short-lived shrub species. So 20, 30 years from now, if fire doesn't come through here again, you're going to see the understory open up and ceanothus slowly senesce and die. In some cases, if we have a more frequent fire interval, that could be of considerable concern if ceanothus is adding considerable fuels to the forest floor that doesn't have time to decompose before the next fire comes through. Another, indication that fire is something that's occurred in coast redwood forests for a long time are these fire-following species. So in the CZU complex, lots of really cool, rare, or never before seen plants developed in post-fire environments. So on the left, you can see a milk vetch that had never been found in the Santa Cruz Mountains, Humboldt County milk vetch, which was located in the environment. And there's hundreds of other species that were located in the post-fire environment, and they were documented really well in this iNaturalist project, which I encourage everyone to come or to check out. It's really cool. So kind of in summary of the response of these systems to fire, I think that resprouting species definitely have an early advantage in post-fire recovery. So that's coast redwood, tan oak, Pacific madrone. And high severity fire, which kills Douglas fir, it can potentially promote the dominance of coast redwood over time. Full-size trees of all species die, Douglas fir particularly, but coast redwood dies and resprouts. We saw a lot of old growth Douglas fir die in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and that species is likely most susceptible to a more severe or frequent fire regime over time. So if we see 100% Douglas fir mortality and coast redwood coming back, there's a chance that at the site scale, you might see Douglas fir extirpated on those sites, at least over the next 80 to 100 years. Large redwood nearly always survive fire, regardless of burn severity, but there's a lot more to that story that I want to tell next. And we've got to think about, when we think about the spread of high severity fire in these systems, we have to think about beyond just single species, but the community, as well as the human and economic consequences of an increase in high severity fire in these systems. And we know that low and moderate severity fire can really be used as a tool in these systems, as it was for thousands of years. So let's dive into some burn severity trends and look at some the effects of compounded fire events, which occurred just recently in 2020 in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So when we're talking about burn severity, we know that wildfire is an important disturbance. It's not a new phenomenon in coast redwood forests, but we have to acknowledge that our modern forests look very different than they did from those forests of thousands of years ago or even hundreds of years ago. So we're still really learning how these modern forests are going to respond over time to an increase or frequency of high severity fire. And Kristin covered this, but this is really attributable to that combination of increased fuel accumulation, fire suppression, climate change, and those increases in forest density. So when I look at Big Basin Redwood State Park, this is a burn severity map from Potter. 77% of Big Basin Redwood State Park burned at high burn severity. So that's just a really large proportion of area to burn at that severity. And it's not something that we've seen in recent time. If we look at burn severity trends over the last 40 years or so, you can see that what we've observed is primarily low and moderate severity fire with that mix of high severity fire. So there's always been a component of high severity fire. But in 2020, we saw a huge proportion of the area burned at high severity. So more acres burned in 2020 and at higher severity than at any point in the last 4 decades. This was driven by an incredible lightning event and really dry conditions. So we can't say if this is a new trend, and the next time that coast redwood forests burn, we're going to see a higher rate of high severity, or if this was simply an anomaly. I mean, this fire, this lightning storm started multiple fires throughout the range. So it was a really unique occurrence. The next thing I want to discuss is compounded fires in coast redwood forests. So a compounded fire is when an area burns twice in a relatively short time. And this occurred in the CZU complex of 2020, which reburned the Lockheed fire of 2009. So the Lockheed fire actually burned at relatively low severity. But if we fast forward 11 years, we see that areas that burned in the Lockheed fire experienced higher severity during the CZU complex. So we saw an increase in severity just a decade later in an area that had burned. So this is a concerning trend because it suggests that areas that burn severely are actually relatively rapidly ready to burn severely again. And we knew this was the case for many systems across California, but we're really just starting to kind of begin to understand that under modern conditions, this could also be true in coast redwood systems. So this is a concerning trend. With that said, there is kind of a glimmer of hope when we look at these two fires, and this has to be analyzed further. But there's some indications that areas that burned at low severity had potentially a moderating effect on the subsequent fire. But those areas that burned at moderate or high severity in 2009 typically burned at moderate or even higher severity than it did in the past. So something to be concerned about and something to watch. So if redwood survives high severity fire, why should we even care about a potential increase in its scale or frequency? I think it's easy to get complacent in coast redwood forest systems because they have this amazing ability to resprout and regrow, and they're actually really inspiring places in post-fire environments, which I don't think you can say for a lot of forest systems. So I just want to briefly cover a few unknowns, knowing that we saw that huge proportion of high severity fire in the 2020 fires, but also that these compounded events could have significant ecological consequences. I just wanted to kind of go over why should we care about high severity fire to kind of close out the presentation. So as Kristen mentioned, less than 5% of all old growth redwoods exist, are left in the range. And this is a picture I took after the CZU complex in Big Basin. It's an old growth individual that lived. So you can see in that yellow circle, this tree is resprouting. So in a scientific study, you might just say this tree lived and move on to the next tree. But in this case, this tree isn't structurally sound. It's kind of a tripod. I doubt that it's going to survive for more than 10 or 15 years. And when I look at a tree like this, I think, what if a fire does come back through this system in the next 10 years? We only have 5% of our range of old growth redwoods left. We need to try to protect as many old growth individuals as we can, particularly if our fire regime is changing to a more frequent, more severe fire regime in the future. So we got to continue monitoring, tracking, and protecting old growth forests in these systems as best as we can, particularly if we want to try to protect special individuals from structural collapse over time. Another thing that kind of struck me in both the CZU complex, but also up in the Chetco bar fire, was old growth Douglas fir mortality. You've got trees between 300 and 500 years old that they're just dead. Large stands of old growth Douglas fir dead. And just in 2000, in this amazing book, The Redwood Forest, that I use as a reference manual all the time, you can see that 24 years ago, we basically thought that thick-barked old growth Douglas fir were extremely resistant to fire. We now know that that's not true, that we're at a severity where there's many individuals that die, broad scale mortality. So when we think about the resistance and resilience of coast redwood fire, I don't want us to forget that we thought about this about Douglas fir just 24 years ago. So I just don't want us to get complacent when we think about the way that the old growth, thick-barked, resilient coast redwood might respond to future fire conditions. Old growth Douglas fir mortality is concerning, particularly for the marbled murrelet and other wildlife that are extremely dependent upon that species in these systems for nesting. So the extirpation of old growth Douglas fir could have significant consequences that go beyond just the forest. I'm not going to cover this too much because I know Cleo is going to discuss this, thinking about fog in the coast redwood system. But when I think about an increase in high severity fire or the ability for coast redwood to capture fog, and I think about how high severity fire modifies the structure of individual trees in these systems, I think about how in moderate severity fire, these trees are going to regenerate canopies really rapidly. But if we see widespread branch loss and low recovery of old growth individuals throughout the coast redwood range as fire increases in the system, we could see considerably modified hydrology in these systems, less potential for these individuals to capture fog. This isn't something that's been shown, but it's something that we need to continue research and look at. The slower development of a canopy can also, alter understory communities as well. There's some evidence that areas that burned at higher severity and have more light have more ceanothus, taller ceanothus in the CZU complex, for example. Something we also need to keep watching and researching. So fire is a really important part of coast redwood forest. It can have considerable ecological benefits, but we have to learn to live with it and promote good fire in these systems because it's not going anywhere. So if we can get back to a system as it was managed over the past 10,000 years, I think that that's likely going to be best ecologically, economically, and socially. So our management goal has to promote forest resilience and good fire in these systems. In the long term, in a post-fire system, at the site scale, at the stand scale, if it meets your objectives, it's really best to give your forest time to respond to the fire, to assess delayed mortality. Watch and learn from the past fire to try to plan for the future. I want to encourage everyone to develop a stewardship plan for their forest, whether they're in a pre-fire or post-fire condition, and update your existing plan as a fire does occur, and recognize that we can't manage everywhere. We need to prioritize those sites for management, whether it be on your own property or whether it be at the landscape scale. We've got to prioritize those sites that are most important to you ecologically, economically, or socially. In a post-fire environment, the most common question we get is likely, should we plant seedlings? And it's a more complex question in coast redwood forest than it is in other systems. It's not always necessary. It's actually typically not necessary. It can be conducive on some sites. For example, you can infill sites with high rates of Douglas fir mortality. You consider a climate adaptive action to potentially plant redwood, for example. But this is something that you should really include in your stewardship plan. And I think it's really important in these cases because density is a problem in post-fire environments in coast redwood forest to consult a registered professional forester to get a good prescription when it comes to that. It's extremely important to reduce post-fire fuels in these systems. High severity fire can create a lot of fuel. So we've got to think about different methods, and those can include pile burning, prescribed fire after 4 or 5 years, prescribed mastication or chipping. And in some cases, in immediate post-fire environment, there is funding for these types of activities. So it's something to consider if your property is fire affected. Kristin discussed potential for sprout clump thinning. That's something that we're kind of thinking about researching and looking into further. Current guidance is to wait, 8 to 10 years for sprout clump thinning. At localized scales, like around your house, for example, you can start thinning sprouts much more early in the post-fire environment, but just recognize that you might see resprouting relatively rapidly. The shrub response can be managed early around high priority and high risk areas, but it does seem in early cases that it's more effective if you wait at broad scales, particularly if you're using tools like masticators, for example. In post-fire environments, salvage is a viable option. It requires professional consultation and permitting with a registered professional forester. So if that's something that you're interested in, I recommend you consult an RPF. Note that merchantable redwood very often live, but that fire can affect the long-term merchantability if there's wood rot. And this is something that there was considerable thought on in the post-fire environment, the CZU. And there's a lot of good research being done right now on the effect of fire and the long-term merchantability of redwood. So stay tuned on that. Douglas fir that are killed by fire, they have a relatively short shelf life. So the big picture to build resilience, I think that we need to increase the pace and scale of prescribed fire. We need to bring good fire back to landscape and see more low and moderate severity fire that's on our terms to promote those positive social and ecological benefits that we can see in these systems. Whenever possible, if you're going to be stewarding your land, think about talking to your neighbor. I think that we're going to get the most bang for our buck if we're connecting projects across the landscape. We need to consider approaches that accelerate the transition of younger forest to old growth, like those projects in Redwood Rising or that are reducing the density and accelerating the growth of trees. It makes the forest more resilient over time. We can think about employing climate adaptive strategies in these systems, like infilling redwood, for example. There's a number of other options as well. And there's a lot of research to be done in post-fire redwood systems. I think that we need to really continue research that guides our managers towards the most effective strategies to build resilience in these systems. So some resources available to help here. The one thing I want to say is if your house isn't in order, you can't get your forest in order. So I encourage everyone to harden your home and property. And here's some resources, everything from Forest and Fire Advisor. Think about contacting your local prescribed burn association. A list of registered professional foresters are available online. And your local resource conservation district likely has great materials available for post-fire management. So with that, thank you so much. And I can take questions if there's time.
Well, that was great, Brian. Thank you so much. And I have to say from the stewardship perspective or the stewardship part of the program, I really appreciate that plug to have a forest stewardship / management plan, whether you own 1 acre, 10 acre, 100 acre, it's really important. So appreciate that. If anybody has any questions for Brian, please pop them in the chat box. Yeah, I don't see any right this moment, but go ahead and put them in, and we'll move on to the next speaker, and then we can circle back to Brian if there are questions.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so up next, Cleo, do you want to give who's going to talk about future climate predictions and fire planning for coast redwood forests? You want to give us a quick bio background, and then you can start.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to both of the other presenters. I learned a lot about redwoods, and I'm so excited to be in conversation. My name is Cleo Woelfle-Hazard, and I am the fire advisor for Humboldt and Del Norte counties. And I'm about 6 months into my job here, based out of Eureka. And I am not a forester, and I know very little about redwood trees, but I do know something about fire hydrology. My background is in aquatic ecology. I studied salmon down in Salmon Creek in Sonoma County for my PhD while I was at UC Berkeley. And I also do a lot of tribal-led projects on rivers, and through that work with the Cuttick tribe in here in Northern California, I got involved in fire and really interested in the interactions between fire and water. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, and looking forward to trying to tie together some of these hydrology pieces that both affect redwoods, and as you'll see, are also affected by them. So here on the slide, you can see on the left, there's a little juvenile coho salmon in a redwood stream. Thank you for circling it. And this is and then on the right, you can see some of my community collaborators. They're doing a wet-dry mapping survey on a tributary of Salmon Creek near Bodega, California. And wet-dry mapping is a technique that is really useful in streams that become intermittent or turn into a series of disconnected pools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in general, I'm going to start first talking about fire hydrology, how fire and water affect one another, then move on to redwood hydrology, focusing on Salmon Creek. Next, I'll talk about climate modeling and an approach for projecting fog and fire weather under different climate change scenarios that I'm developing with some climate modelers. And I'll end up talking about some planning that I've co-led with members of the Cuttick tribe and the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership to both plan for reintroducing beneficial fire into our Northern California landscapes, and to understand how stream flow might change under different kinds and amounts of forest management, including thinning and also prescribed burning and managed wildfire or strategic firing. So you can go to the next slide. So first, fire affects water. So you can see here a river floodplain. This is based on the Mid-Klamath. And you can see here a number of different ecocultural plants, birds, riverine animals, fishes, and also people, particularly cultural stewards, tribal stewards, but really everyone who's interacting with the landscape. And so fire can affect summer stream flow. When there's a big smoke event, that can actually decrease the amount of water that plants are using, or even when and raise the river of the level of a stream slightly, or when a catastrophic wildfire comes through, that can also raise the level of the stream, as we'll see in a minute. Also, smoke can cool a river, and actually Karik and other tribal peoples of the North Coast would use fire to actually initiate salmon migration by sending a cue to salmon through this cooler water that it was time to come upstream. Post-fire, we can see a lot more runoff when there's not a canopy or duff layer to retain that water. And so you can get large scouring floods and debris flows, which are these large landslides that can happen after fire. So you can go on to the next slide. And so just as an example of this, the way that fire can actually affect stream flow, this is the Slater fire, which is actually part of the same kind of regional lightning effect event that Brian was mentioning. So the Slater fire came through near the town of Happy Camp down the Indian Creek watershed. You can see in this figure kind of on the lower right the extent of that fire, and it almost completely encompasses the Indian Creek watershed, which is a tributary of the Klamath River. In that upper right, you can see the really severe fire effects. This was largely in this picture of Douglas fir, and there were a lot of black oak and white oak trees in this area. And so essentially this fire killed every single tree, or if it didn't kill it, it burned up all its leaves, so the trees were no longer transpiring water. So go to the next slide. So then this is what happened to the stream. So on this is a graph, a hydrograph, so from a stream gauge. So on the x-axis here, you can see the days. So it goes from September 8th, when the fire started, where that orange line is, through September 14th. And you can see before the fire, the water level is going up and down, and this is called the riparian pump. So the water level rises at night when the plants aren't transpiring as much, especially the alders and willows along the stream. And then the level of the stream goes down in the day when those streamside plants are sucking up water. After the fire, you can see the water keeps rising. It doesn't go back down. And it actually increased by 10 cubic feet per second, which is significant amount of water for a stream of this size. And so this, we obviously don't want to see high severity fires like the Slater fire. However, it is interesting to think about how might more moderate intensity fires or just burning in that riparian corridor affect stream flow and perhaps raise the level of the stream over some of these critical thresholds for salmon and other fishes. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so now let's just talk a little bit more about redwoods and fog and stream flow. I'm going to build on what Brian was saying about fog in the redwoods to kind of show how redwood interactions with fog can influence streams and salmon. So this is it's a kind of an older image, but it's from the Redwood Symposium back in 2014. And so you can see on the top, typical redwood and fog. And then you can see, can you go back? Yeah. You can see in the middle here, these different densities of trees, and that those densities kind of correspond with that aerial image on the bottom, which is showing the height. So the red dots are the really tall trees there. And you can see as that density of trees per acre or per hectare is decreasing, the amount of water that they're able to store is increasing. So when you have this young stands with 99 trees, they're still, storing an impressive 5,000 plus liters of water. But when you get down to these old growth trees, 3 trees per acre, they're able to store 15,000 plus liters of water. And that's all water that's being caught in their canopy and then slowly dripping down into the soil, feeding a lot of those understory plants and eventually making its way into the stream during the summer months when that water is the most crucial for aquatic species, including salmon and other fishes. So you can go to the next slide. And so I learned about this in Salmon Creek in Sonoma County. And so this, you can see on the right, two tributaries of Salmon Creek, Fay Creek and Tanner Creek. In general, Fay Creek is more intermittent and Tanner is more perennial, although during the extreme drought years, 2014 and 15, Tannery Creek also became intermittent. And you can see on the upper left there, what, this kind of divide between these two tributaries, and on the bottom, what Fay Creek looks like once it has kind of dried up and there are these disconnected pools where salmon are still able to survive. And so this pattern of hydrology is largely influenced by geology. So you can see on the map on the right, you have this purple color, which is this metamorphic rock, this Franciscan melange, which does not store very much water. And then on these ridge tops between Fay and Tannery, and in these kind of higher layers, there's this sandstone formation called the Wilson Grove, which does store a lot more water. And then you can see these little blue dots kind of on the edge of this sandstone that are these springs. And these springs are perennial, and they feed these sanctuary reaches, which are these little pools where salmon can survive through the summer. So you can go to the next slide. And as I mentioned before, many California coastal streams become disconnected during the dry season. So on the left, you're looking down on the stream in plan view, and on the right, you're kind of looking at a cross section. So on the top, you can see there's a spring-fed tributary. The whole stream is flowing continuously. On the right, you can see what that means. The riffle, that shallower area where the water flows over the rocks, is all underwater. There's continuous flow, and that flow adds oxygen to the water and keeps the levels to where salmon and other aquatic species can survive. In the summer, as that stream dries up and as those aquifers are depleted, the water falls down below the level of the riffle. Some of those riffles go dry. And then there's these deeper pools that are these sanctuary pools that might be also kind of adjacent to or connected to bedrock, like this gray outcrop there. And these are where we see fishes, again, surviving through the summer. So you can go to the next slide. So just to show you what one of these streams looks like, this is on Fay Creek. This is one of these sanctuary pools, and you can see, there's some water, but there's a lot of dry gravel. And this was a pool where in one year, even after long dry summer, there are still 136 juvenile coho and steelhead in this pool, which is 83% survival, which is really good if you're a salmon fry. And these pools where coho and steelhead can still survive are pools with enough groundwater or spring flow. And there's actually a little trickling, kind of drippy tributary that goes into this pool that keeps that dissolved oxygen just high enough for those fish not to suffocate. So you can go to the next slide. And so, geology and vegetation are going to influence how much rain reaches the groundwater. And geology is also going to, influence how much water plants can access and that drought stress that Kristin was mentioning. So this is a map that I put together just using different layers. On the left, you can see the different layers that I used to create the map. So, and they're kind of weighted based on a approach that folks from the Sonoma Ecology Center had used. So in this case, we weighted soils at 25%, vegetation at 10, geology at 50%, and slope at 15. You could do those in different ways. But what we found on the right is this groundwater recharge potential in the Salmon Creek watershed. And again, you can see those blue and green areas are right where those sandstone layers are. And that's also where we find a lot of redwoods, but we also do find redwoods down in the valleys nearer to the streams, and that's where this kind of supplement from the needles dripping this fog condensation that's captured in the summer can be really significant subsidy to both the soil moisture and then to the stream flow. It's gonna go to the next slide. And this was a really cool image. It's like from a kid's science site that I thought was great, that shows, redwoods have this really interesting capacity hydrologically to not only collect and drip fog, but also to absorb it through their needles. And so Todd Dawson did some of his work on using stable isotopes to kind of track how much water within the xylem of the tree was actually from fog versus from rainfall. And during the summer months, that amount from fog within the tree's own sap could be, up to 30%, which is pretty remarkable. So going to the next slide. So this is again from my own work there, and what this is showing is this riparian pump that I mentioned before, and the effect of fog in particular on stream flow. And so this isn't from fog directly dripping into the stream. This is because on foggy days, those plants are photosynthesizing less, and so they're releasing less water through their stomata. And what you can see in this purple line, which is the depth, it's kind of hard to see at this scale, but that line does go up a little bit in those gray shaded periods when it's cloudy, and then it goes down in the sunnier times. And then in these other lines, another one that's interesting to look at is the blue line, the dissolved oxygen, and then that red dashed line, which is the lethal limit for salmonid fishes. And so what you can see is that these streams are very close to that lethal limit by mid-July. And so any extra water that you can get that will keep the stream flowing, even for a little while longer, can delay this onset of these like really lethal oxygen conditions. So you can go to the next slide. So I know we're getting a little bit away from redwoods, but this is all connected because we're seeing stream flow really influencing where these fishes survive or don't survive based on the kind of how intermittent the stream is. So you can go to the next slide. And this is just like a little bit different way of looking at that. So on the upper right, we have like a live fish, and then on the lower right, it's hard to see, but there's this little white line kind of toward the lower left of the photo, and that's where one of these salmon fry has died because the oxygen has gotten too low. Yeah, thank you for circling it. And so on the left is that more you can see basically what to take away from this is that there was a lot of pools where the coho died, some of the steelhead survived, but we can again identify these areas where you see the little fish icon and where you see this blue line instead of the red line on the stream. These are these sanctuary pools that are sustained by groundwater in these coastal streams. So going to the next slide. So thinking about fog and redwoods and the role that they play in kind of the broader hydrology, it's interesting to think about how fog and clouds might change in the future. And you hear a lot of people say things like, well, with climate change, it's going to be warmer and there's going to be, fewer clouds and less fog, and thus we're going to see more drought and mortality of redwoods. However, that is not actually known. There are a lot of unknowns, and that is not settled, and all of these relationships are pretty complicated. So some research is showing that we could see that there has been a slight but significant decrease from 1950 to 2012, and this was using airport data from up and down the coast. In Northern California, this decrease is likely driven by natural variability. So this phenomena called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, that's like a global climate phenomena that affects sea surface temperature and salmon runs and all different kinds of things. In Southern California, this decrease is probably because of urbanization and the urban heat island effect. But in climate models, clouds can have really variable effects. So as you can see in this picture on the bottom, clouds both scatter solar radiation, so decreasing the temperature, but they also trap thermal radiation, that's coming up from the land. And a lot of this difference is based on the color of the cloud, or what climate scientists would call albedo. So these lighter clouds are going to be more reflective and maybe lead to overall cooling. The darker gray clouds are going to be more, be less reflective. And so climate modelers, there's a lot of uncertainty in future climate projections because of these different characteristics of clouds. You can go to the next slide. And so, this is some interesting work that was kind of summarizing some of these cloud effects for these two different areas. This is on the Central Coast. So the BML is the Bodega Marine Lab, which is, again, just close to Bodega, California. And inland is the Pepperwood Preserve, which you can see is kind of at this northern extent of this plume of fog that's coming in over the San Francisco Bay. Go to the next slide. And so this paper found, some declines historically in coastal low clouds and fog. And again, this is uncertain, and there's kind of more confidence in what's going on with the ocean clouds offshore and south of California, where there's kind of medium confidence that these low clouds are going to decrease, but there's really not a lot of certainty in what's going to happen more in Northern California. So going to the next slide. And so there's some counteracting ways that climate change could impact fog. So on what you can see on this figure A here is the amount of fog that you're having, with the red being like 1 hour of fog per day, the blue being 14 hours of fog per day. And why might this be, and how might this change in the future? So first, if there's predicted that the sea surface temperature is going to be higher, since fog is caused by a difference in between the temperature over the ocean and over the land. If those temperatures are more similar because the ocean temperature is warmer, then that would lead to less fog formation. Warmer air temperatures also mean that fog evaporates more quickly, and warmer temperatures in Central California lead to a higher temperature difference. Conversely, could lead to a higher temperature difference between coast and land, pulling more fog onto land. So fog could increase, fog could decrease. It's really hard to tell. The models, it's like one of these unknown unknowns where we don't know what's going to happen, so we can predict it, but not with a lot of confidence. Going to the next slide. So one of the projects that I'm excited about working on in this area of fire and fog hydrology is to use climate models to understand future fog and cloud dynamics and their effect on redwood distribution. So this is a figure from Emily Francis, who's done a lot of work on redwood distribution in different parts of the Central and North Coast, and is now moving up into Humboldt and Del Norte County. And then Daniel Tuma, who's a climate scientist at University of Texas. So some of the questions that we're interested in are how will future fog and drought affect redwoods, and what climate model outputs can we use to represent fog. And so going to the next slide. So similar questions can be asked about fire, again, using the same climate models that are showing us how the air temperature, the humidity, and other aspects of the climate are going to change in the future. And so these are some slides from my collaborator, Danielle Toma. So thinking about, in terms of the climate system, how are humans changing wildfire risk? So to the next slide. So there's ignition sources, so power lines, chains dragging on the road, all the ignition sources that we can think of. Next one. As we expand the wild land urban interface and infrastructure ages, we might have more ignitions in the future. Next one. There's also the available resources to burn, so fuel loading. Next one. So fire suppression is obviously increasing the available resources. Other land management practices might be decreasing. There's drought conditions. Next one. So that's both fire weather conditions. So what are the types of heat and wind patterns that lead to ignitions? And then, anthropogenic climate change is obviously affecting both drought and fire weather conditions. And that's kind of where Danielle and I are working. Next slide. Sorry, next one. Yeah. And so this is a little bit complicated. We're not going to go into it too much, but there's ways to quantify the climate conditions that increase wildfire risk. And so what goes into these models are these arrows. So you have maximum temperature, precipitation, relative humidity, and wind speed. And then these give these different indices that kind of show you the kind of the probability of the severity of the fire weather. And so the one that Danielle works with is the Canadian Fire Weather Index. The data can come from observations or models, and it has a minimum of 0, no maximum, but usually below 100. And higher values are associated with higher wildfire risk. So next slide. So we have started to develop this for the Cuttick territory, which is not redwood country, but it's just inland from what redwood country. So I'm going to show these examples and we can talk about what they might mean for the redwoods. So we can see here from this fire weather index. So again, it has a maximum of 100. You can see this, it's going from 0 to above 50. It has this strong seasonal cycle where summer and fall have higher fire weather index values. And this is looking from 2000 through 2022. And it can also vary from day to day. And one of the things that we're discussing with our Cuttick partners is, what are other variables we need to identify burn windows for the Cuttick ancestral territory. Next slide. And so then we can compare these predictions of fire weather indices to actual fire observations from NASA satellite data. And so these shaded bars you can see are where there was actually a fire, and because of the different satellites, those are those two top lines. We have some that are we have two different satellites that are kind of showing that. And so we can see that sometimes when there's a high fire weather index, like in 2018, where this box is circling, that there was a prediction from this climate model that we would have a fire, and indeed we had big fires. But other times there was a prediction that there would be a lot of fires, and there just didn't happen to be a lot of fires. So is that because the index is wrong, or some other factor that is not related? That's one of the questions we can ask. Next slide. And so we're zooming in to 2017, and this is kind of looking at, and this is at a, again, for the Cuttick ancestral territory, some of these places where on the left is the mean fire weather index, and on the right is the maximum. And then we can see on the far right these fire count totals for 2017. Oops, sorry, I just messed up my slides. And the turquoise shading is the extent of fires that happen in that time. So again, you can see there's not a perfect match, and so there's some work to be done to improve this fire weather index to show when we actually will have fires in this area. Next. And one of the things, to talk about is, why not? And it might be vegetation, it might be other ideas. So then what about the future? So again, we can use this model, and one of these models that we've developed, which is a lot finer resolution than what's shown here, to project the number of extreme fire weather days per year. And I can go into this more in the Q&A if you're interested. But in general, that the orange line is the average across this ensemble of simulations, and then those gray lines are the individual simulations, and that orange bar is showing the 25th to it's like a confidence interval of some of that variability. So we expect that most of the future weather would fall within that light orange bar, and we can see that this orange line is going up, and so we're expecting, at least for this area, that we will see, more of these extreme fire weather days in the future. Next slide. And so, what we can do to try to better understand what this might mean for our forests is, and this is what Danielle's working on right now, is we can recalculate this fire weather index for 1 kilometer grid cells. Currently, this is calculated at 25 kilometers. And then we can also, recalculate this index for the credit or other areas, kind of depending on some of these other factors that people think might be important. Next slide. And so I know we're really low on time, and I'll just zoom through this. So how would a maximum, so in the big picture, we can think with maps and climate models about how to manage our landscapes to reduce this fire risk, given this future fire regime that we can see on the horizon and are already experiencing. So this is one of these projects that I've developed with PI Leif Hillman and other collaborators. Next slide. And so, we developed this model for the Credit territory, but we can expand it to the Coast Range and the Redwoods to see where redwoods might persist by the late 21st century, what managed fire intervals will protect coastal communities given future fire weather, and where do people agree that fires should be allowed to burn versus using some of these other management techniques that Kristin was discussing. Next slide. And so this is just an example of what some of these vegetation maps might look like with different treatments. This is for 2050, and it can be used by PBAs and other prescribed burn associations and other management partners to kind of plan this work where it's going to have the desired effect in terms of wildfire protection, ecological resilience, and also ecocultural use by tribes and tribal members. Next slide. So with that, I will thank you very much, and hopefully we have time for a few questions. And yeah, thanks again for coming to spend the evening with us.
Great, thanks, Cleo. That was awesome. Any questions for Cleo? I know there's a couple questions that were put in the chat box that Kristin has responded to, so appreciate that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording after another thank you to all of our speakers.